The day my daughter drew the extra window, the varnish on the floor still smelled like strangers. We had lived in the row house on Fleet Street for 9 days. Boxes were unlabeled in a way that felt like a dare. Our cat, spleeny and territorial, had found a new hiding place behind the washing machine and refused to come out unless bribed with salmon. I had told myself moving in winter would be an act of optimism. Snow-tamped sidewalks, the town's old bricks salted white, everything pared down to bone and function. On Fleet Street, mugs clinked behind thin walls. Someone tuned a violin on Saturdays. There was a bakery around the corner that boiled bagels in something sweet so the street smelled like sugar. I had told myself we could start over. That was the phrase I used when I signed the lease with the landlord, a woman with clean, competent hands who wore a key ring at her belt like a sheriff. An East Coast start over. My ex stayed in the Midwest with teaches drama in a gymnasium earnestness. He sent our daughter postcards that always arrived bent, as if something had sat on them in the mail. She stuck them to the fridge with letter magnets and recited the states out loud, her small voice shaping the names like fortunes. Alabama, Nebraska, Wyoming. Her name is Hannah, 6 years old, missing one front tooth. She draws with the intensity of someone siphoning meaning out of a world that keeps changing its furniture. On the morning the drawing came home from school, I had already folded into the day's shape. Keys, coffee, the heat kicking on with a sigh. I pulled the paper from her backpack and saw our house. A brown rectangle, a white door, 4 little windows in neat rows like stitches. And then a 5th window, taller, thinner, set in the long interior wall along the stair. The wall that was lath and plaster and history and no window. "What's this one?" I asked lightly, tapping the extra window with a nail I should have clipped. Hannah's eyes did that thing where she looked near me instead of at me, like she was searching the air for a better question. "That's the window," she said, as if it were the only answer. "The blue one." "There's no window on the stair wall," I said. "Honey, do you mean the window on the landing?" She shook her head. "The blue one, by the hum." "You hear a hum?" "At night," she said, "when the cat doesn't come out." I smiled, not wanting to feed whatever this was. New house nerves, I told myself. Old house noises, plumb lines and pipes and wind curling into seams. Still, the drawing ended up pinned on the fridge, next to a map of the United States. The extra window stared at me while I made grilled cheese, while I wiped the counter, while I told the cat to be braver. That night I stood in the stairwell in my socks, the house gone queer and amplified with sleep. The heating system ticked like a polite clock. I listened for a hum. It felt like the way memory hums, present but not locatable. "The blue one," she'd said. The only blue light in the house came from the router in the living room. The stairwell was a tall, pale throat, with a banister that warmed under your palm. I ran my fingers along the wall. The plaster was smooth, except where someone had skim-coated over old picture holes. When I pressed my ear against the wall, cold climbed into the cartilage. I heard nothing. If you've never moved with a child, it is all threshold and pledge. Every night you say the same things so they can be true. The house is good. The locks are strong. The cat is only hiding. Dreams are busy, and then they're done. I'd left a marriage that had ended like a slow leak. No calamity, no smashing. Just a quiet emptiness that grew until every object echoed. Hannah slept with a nightlight shaped like a moon. Every night she asked if the moon would still be there in the morning. I always said yes. 2 nights after the drawing, I woke to a sound like paper tearing, soft and not quite there. I went still and held my breath so my body wouldn't step on the sound. Street light reached in through the bedroom blinds. Heat settled. I heard it again. Not inside the room, but near the stair. A thin, steady hum threaded under the quiet. A voice, not a voice. I walked to the hall and stood halfway down the stairs. The hum was there if I let my ears go loose, like those magic eye posters you can only see if you unfocus. It came from the long wall, halfway up, where the paint had been rolled a shade too quickly and a small sag had formed. The sound was human work disguised as house. I pressed my ear to the plaster. The hum vibrated against bone. Vibration means movement. The wall was doing something. Not breathing exactly, but not still. I tapped once with my knuckle. The sound came back dull as living tissue. I felt that particular fear that is also curiosity, the one that makes you pull the curtain back, even when it's better for your heart if you don't. I went to the kitchen for a flashlight and remembered my father showing me how to find studs with a magnet. He had been patient with magnets, less patient with everything else. I held the heavy flashlight in my hand and considered the hour. The way the house was a box with other boxes touching it. Row houses are conversations, whether or not the neighbors want to talk. I put my ear to Hannah's door. She breathed full and trustful. I stood with my hand on her doorknob until the hum resolved into something like an electric throat clearing, and then was gone. In the morning, I did the thing that people do now when the world throws them a tile of oddness. I searched for hidden window and row house shafts and humming wall, and fell into a quiet warren of old house forums where men with screen names like Spackle Guy told you not to panic until you had reason. Service chases, someone wrote. Old houses had service chases, narrow vertical shafts for pipes and wires. Once they had been used for coal chutes, dumbwaiters, laundry. If you shined a light at night and saw a glow, it meant someone had put something in the shaft. An LED, a camera, or a cheap monitor. If it hummed, it was not mouse, but machine. I clicked and clicked until the morning turned metallic and cold. I stopped when the cat crawled out, eyes huge, tail low, and flattened himself against the stair, at the exact spot where Hannah had drawn the extra window. He made a sound like a question. We were not the first tenants of Fleet Street. The landlord had told me 4 families had lived there in the last 5 years, flagging it as neighborhood churn, not plague. The woman with the keys had looked me in the eye and asked what I did. I told her I taught writing online to grown-ups who wanted to make shapes out of themselves. She made a note on a paper that had words blacked out by a Sharpie. Teaching, she said, in a voice I couldn't read. That's good. The bakery's owner was a woman who might have been 60, or might have been 55, and hard used by yeast. She knew everything. Fleet Street is a narrow length. Gossip travels like steam. When I asked her, lightly, if the houses had quirks, she laughed into her coffee and said, "They're all quirks." Most of the shafts got sealed during the big insulation rage 5 years back, but not all. My brother installs cameras. You'd be amazed how many folks try to watch what isn't theirs. People think walls behave. She slid a bag of bagels toward me. "You got leaks?" she asked. "Or neighbors?" "Just drafts," I said. She nodded as if this was an answer. I decided to mark a line. A mother's work in a strange house is choosing what to be afraid of. I did not want to teach Hannah to be afraid of walls. When she came home from school with her cheeks pinked by cold, I made cocoa and asked about recess. I said nothing about shafts. We played Uno, and she cheated in that way children cheat, where they put the card they need under a thigh. At bedtime, she pointed to the hall and said, "The hum is quiet tonight." I told her that sometimes houses get tired too. To prove something to myself that night, I stood in the stairwell with the flashlight and my phone. I opened the voice recorder and let the phone sit on the step while the house settled. I had read on a forum that if you record empty rooms, you can catch frequencies your ear will miss. I felt ridiculous. The hum felt ridiculous. But doing nothing began to feel like neglect. The cat sat on the landing, with his ears like sails. A recording captured the heat clicking off, and the half-life of hot metal. It captured my feet shifting. A night bus 2 streets over. The cat swallow. And then there it was, 2 minutes and 19 seconds in. The low electric tone, steady and almost tender, like a small machine remembering a song. I stopped the recording when I heard the noise outside, the whisper scrape of shoes on the icy sidewalk, the pause at our stoop that was longer than a passing. new town. I told myself, people stand where they shouldn't when sidewalks are slick. But it felt like something very specific had found our address. In the morning, the landlord answered my text with reassuring swiftness. Likely an old chase, she wrote. Most are sealed at each floor. I can arrange an inspection next week. It's probably nothing. Probably is one of those words that fall apart if you touch them. I thought about calling the non-emergency line and asking if they do wellness checks on houses. I thought about the father of a girl in Hannah's class who had smiled at me too long on curriculum night and said, "We're so glad to have new faces in the district." I thought about uniforms and reports and the official naming of things. Instead, I dropped Hannah at school and went to City Hall on my lunch break. Because paperwork is a vocabulary I understand. The town clerk directed me, after some rummaging through drawers with labels like 1970s permits, mislash, to a room with large flat files and a single desk lamp. The man at the desk wore a cardigan in the shade of old earth and read a book with a stamp on it. He did not ask my name, he asked my address. When I told him, he pulled a drawer and rolled out blueprints that smelled like history. Fleet Street, parcel maps, renovations in 1998, when someone added a half bath. There it was, a narrow rectangle labeled Service Chase, along the stairwell, running the length of the house from basement to roof. A note in pencil, Rem Access Hatch, East Wall, sealed 2003. Does anyone still use these? I asked, and felt foolish because the question sounded like I believed in secret passageways. They use what they can, the man said. We close, people open. That's the dance. You looking for a leak? I heard a hum, I said. He smiled, not unkindly. Back home, I showed Hannah the city's photocopy of the blueprint. She traced the stair with one finger and put the other hand on the blank wall as if measuring if the drawing fit. She said, "Is that where the window is?" I told her it was just where people hid old pipes. Then why is it blue? She asked. What's blue? The light, she said. Sometimes the window is asleep, and sometimes it blinks like this. She blinked in demonstration, deliberate and slow, like someone trying to be believed. Who told you about the window? I asked. She thought. Nobody, she said, then said, but the lady across the alley said the houses breathe. She said to tell Mama if something breathes too loud. Across the alley lived a woman named Jo, who had pulled up in a green van the day we moved in and carried our heaviest box as if it were filled with leaves. She had given Hannah a wind-up toy that waddled and said, I used to teach second grade until my hearing got precious. Precious was a word I loved in her mouth. She had eyes like the sky after snow, and made a point of not coming over uninvited. When I knocked on her door that afternoon, she opened with no hesitation and put a kettle on, as if that were a muscle memory. You've been listening, she said, and I nodded. She told me about old houses and old men, and maintenance shafts where everything accumulates. Heat, dust, secrets. They sealed a lot of access points after that thing 5 winters ago, she said, and waited. Man 2 blocks up kept a room behind his closet, cameras. The landlord blamed the tenants for not noticing. That's silly. People don't expect to be looked at in their socks. She slid a mug closer to me. Do you want me to stand in your stairwell with you tonight and listen with my precious ears? She asked. And I loved her then, because she made the offer ordinary. That night, after Hannah fell asleep with a book open on her chest, a book about planets, each one a brave circle, I texted Jo. She crossed the alley in a knit hat and stood in my stairwell and closed her eyes. She moved her head like a person listening for the next song on a far-off radio. There, she said, pointing to a spot on the wall, the height of my collarbone. Do you have a small mirror or a piece of glass? I fetched a pocket mirror Hannah had filed with stickers. Jo held it flat against the plaster. Light doesn't leak, she said, unless there's somewhere to go. She tilted the glass, barely, and we both saw it at once, so faint it was almost a mistake. A sliver of blue the size of a fingernail at the mirror's edge. My heart bucked like poorly saddled furniture. Jo did not move except to inhale, slow, as if she were smelling a flower that might be poisonous. "It's not your router," she said. "It's not enough to be a screen. It's enough to be an indicator. Little LED, something someone forgot to tape over." "Someone where?" I asked, and when the word left my mouth, it felt like the first time I'd let the thought be visible. Jo opened her eyes and said nothing. The house ticked in small, self-repair ways. She put her palm on the wall, and for a second I thought she was praying. "I'll call the landlord in the morning," I said, because this was the path that made the world continue in its regular shape. The cut in the wall, the reveal, and the reckoning. But morning is a poor negotiator. The landlord texted that she had a plumber already scheduled for a burst on Willow and could have my guy come by Wednesday. Today was Monday. I stood in the stairwell with my face near the plaster and Hannah's drawing on the fridge behind me, and thought of all the women I had read about who decided to wait until a man with a truck said he could make time. I took Hannah to school. Her teacher gave me the kind of smile reserved for the mothers who show up early. On the bulletin board outside the classroom, there were houses drawn by every child, an orchard of rectangles and triangles. Children draw what they know. One boy had drawn a dragon curled on a roof like a cat. Hannah's house had its extra window. It made the drawing look almost elegant, like an old face with an unaccounted-for mole. On the way home, I stopped at a hardware store that sold solutions for people who wanted to believe they had control. I bought painter's tape, a stud finder, a cheap RF detector that beeped when you put it near a microwave, and a knockoff endoscope camera that could be threaded into small spaces. The cashier said, "Working on a project?" as if anything a woman did with tools that fit in a purse was a hobby. I waited until after school, after snack, after homework, after bath. I waited until the house felt like it knew us again. I told Hannah the truth I needed to tell. "I'm going to look behind a wall, sweetheart, because I want to make sure there aren't any old wires that could be trouble." And left out the truth I couldn't make gentle. She sat on the bottom stair and watched me with the solemnity of a small judge. The cat flattened himself against the baseboard and watched the same spot. The stud finder told me what the blueprint had already whispered, that there was a cavity behind the plaster, a vertical emptiness. If you have never cut into a wall you pay for, know this. It is a small betrayal, and it is a relief. I taped off a rectangle, the size of my hand, and took the thin-bladed drywall saw, and took a breath, and began. The first cut squealed. Plaster powder fell like newborn snow. I went slow. Hannah put a hand over her mouth. I wanted a clean rectangle because I wanted to be able to put it back, as if that could erase an act. The blade met no thickness. It felt like swimming. When the last edge gave, a flap of plaster lifted. I set it aside like a mask. Behind it was a space. Dark, smelled like dust. Cold traveled up my arm. I slid the endoscope into the hole, and my phone bloomed with a cave. A rectangular shaft, timbers at the corners, the far side the same as ours. At floor level, bundles of old wire. Halfway up, someone's idea of a patch long ago, foam that had aged to brittle yellow. And there, at just above eye height, fixed to the stud on the far side, was a tiny square of black with a single blue LED winking like a low heartbeat. I felt two feelings at once, rage and relief. Rage that there was a light. Relief that there was a light. Worse would be feeling without seeing. Worse would be an idea without an object. I kept the camera steady with both hands, while the phone showed me the object that made my daughter draw a window that wasn't there. "What is it?" Hannah whispered, as if we were at the zoo watching a nocturnal animal who might be angry at the light. "A bad thing," I said, and then corrected myself because she was 6 and I was supposed to give objects their names. "It's a camera." "Who put it there?" she asked. A question like a hammer. "I don't know yet," yet felt like the first true thing I'd said all day. I filmed the object for as long as I could stand the feeling of my arteries in my face. The cat made a low noise, deep in his throat. When I pulled the camera out, I taped the hole shut with the care people usually reserve for wound dressings. I did what you do if you want the world to become official. I called the non-emergency number and described the thing slowly enough that I would be believed. The officer who came wore a uniform that didn't fit him right in the shoulders. He had the good sense to take notes. He called for a second person to witness. They stood in my stairwell with their boots clean and their faces trying to do neutral. The younger one, a woman with a neat bun, asked if I had touched anything inside the shaft. "Just the air," I said. She said, "That's fine." They took pictures of the hole and the tape and the blue light with the endoscope. They asked the landlord to come. The landlord came with her key ring and her face open and earnest and said, "Oh," in a way that made me feel, for a second, that she had truly not known. "Old houses have shafts," she said, both palms up, as if she could catch any anger I might throw. I thought they were sealed. "I found blueprints," I said, because I wanted her to know I had done my homework. The older officer asked for the name of the previous tenants. The landlord said she could not give out personal information, and the officer said, "We can ask for records with a warrant if it comes to that." He said this gently. The words formed a shape in the air like a responsible door. They sealed the hole with evidence tape and gave me a case number. The younger officer explained chain of custody in words she had said often enough that they were smooth. The landlord said she would call her maintenance person. The older officer said no one should remove anything until a warrant allowed it. The blue light kept its tiny pulse. Hannah watched all of this from the bottom stair, with her hands on her knees, absorbing a new ritual into her understanding of houses. For one night, evidence lived with us. I slept in Hannah's bed with her, in case sleep came as a kindness. It did not. I lay in the sideways dark and listened to the hum at half volume and thought of all the ways the world had taught me to doubt my own witness. I thought of my ex, who had not been cruel but had not known how to stay. I thought of my mother, who used to put tape over the LEDs in hotel rooms. I thought of Jo, across the alley, sitting in her green chair with the lamp on low, reading a book without music because the world had too much sound. In the morning, the younger officer called to say they had a warrant to seize any device in the shaft and to search for access points in my basement and attic and the neighboring properties. The neighbor to the south, a man who wore a coat that made him look like a boulder, answered the door with suspicion, and then relief when the officers said the words "probable cause." The neighbor to the north, a woman I had only seen at a distance, carrying laundry, did not answer. The landlord let the officers into the shared basement, where the old coal bins still lived like small prisons. The device was exactly what the endoscope had promised. A thumb-sized camera glued to a stud in the shaft, powered by a thin wire tunneled through a gap toward the neighbor's side. There was tape residue where someone had once covered the LED and grown careless, or hopeful, or arrogant. The detectives, because now the officers had become detectives by the way they held their shoulders, bagged the camera. The landlord's face was a map of apology that had not yet found its language. "What does it see?" I asked, because this was the only question that mattered. "Not much," the younger detective said. "It would have a view of this shaft, maybe slivers of light around the edge, maybe sound if there's a mic. But it would pick up voices if they were near the wall. It's more a monitor than a lens. A way to know if someone's home by the pattern of sound and light." She met my gaze. "It's still a violation." "How long has it been there?" I asked. No one would have an answer yet. Time would come from glue residue and dust flakes, from the patience of labs, from the willingness of cables to tell the history of hands. The landlord knocked on the north neighbor's door again, insistence now in her knuckles. The door opened. A woman did not stand there. A teenage boy did, bare-armed despite the cold, his hair wet. The officer's posture softened by a degree. He shouted for his mother. She came with a laundry basket, and a face that went blank in the way of people bracing for shame. The detectives explained the shaft, the wire, the camera. The woman's hand tightened on the basket handle. She looked at the boy, and something feral crossed her face, fear ballooning into threat, then receded. "We don't do that," she said, and then to the boy, "Tell them." The boy shook his head and said nothing. It would not be then, I thought. Not because bad things cannot live in thin places, but because the way the woman held her laundry was the way people hold their lives with both hands. The detectives followed the wire along the basement ceiling. It snaked past the bins and through a hole cut neatly in a joist. It disappeared toward the back, where a locked door separated the shared space from a small storage room labeled with a number and a sticker that said "Keep Out" in a cheerful font. "That's Joe's storage," the landlord said. I made an involuntary noise and did not know whether it was language. The detectives looked at me, and then at Joe's sticker, and then at the landlord, who took a breath and produced her keyring, and found the right key with a speed born of habit. The lock turned with the soft click that tells you something is maintained. The door swung inward, and the detectives flicked on a light that made everything honest. If you love someone's kindness, you should also love the study of their harm. Joe's storage room was neat, which felt like betrayal. On the metal shelf, bins labeled in handwriting like mine. Winter hats, tools, garden. On the back wall, a black pegboard with cable ties and a label maker. On the floor, a spool of wire, the twin of the wire in our shaft. On the shelf near the ceiling, a monitor the size of a paperback, dark and dustless. Next to it, a multi-port receiver, the kind that swallows signal like a choir. The detectives did not turn the monitor on. They photographed it the way people photograph a body. The younger detective said, "We'll need you to come downstairs." And her voice to me had a shape in it. A shape like apology that would have to become something else. In the stairwell, I felt the house tilt. It turned out the world will rearrange itself twice in a day and still expect you to walk upright. I looked up at the spot where the hole was taped, and then down at the floor beneath my bare feet, and had the fleeting, irrational thought that houses have been trying to warn us for centuries, that we learned long ago to ignore the hum of the things we did not want to name. They asked Joe to come down. She came without a coat. Her hair was not yet brushed. She looked at the detectives, then at me, and put her hands open at her sides. "What did the wire find?" she asked, as if wires are animals that nose out truth. The older detective said, "Miss Shepherd, we have reason to believe equipment in your storage room is connected to a device in your neighbor's wall." Joe closed her eyes for a heartbeat, and then nodded in a way that was not quite consent, not quite relief. "I collect signals," she said, with the stubborn dignity of a person who has named their harm so small they can carry it. After the accident, my hearing turned into something else. I needed to know what the house was doing. I didn't put anything in anyone's home. The shaft is common space. She looked at me. "I swear to you, I never watched you sleep. I wouldn't." "What did you do?" the younger detective asked, not unkindly. "I watched the light and the noise," Joe said. "Pattern, not picture. Please hear me say I understand the difference. Why is there a camera with an LED?" I asked, and it came out mean, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I needed the world to fit back into categories. She looked down at the concrete floor, as if it had a more forgiving face. "The camera came as part of the set," she said. "The cheapest receiver packs come with cameras. The receiver won't work without something pinging it, but I taped the light." She made a face like disbelief at herself. "I taped the light," she repeated, as if repetition could make it truer. "It's a violation," the older detective said, and even saying the word felt like a ceremony. Even if you didn't watch or record, a device in a shared shaft aimed toward a residence is going to be considered a surveillance device. We'll need to take the equipment, and we'll need statements. Joe nodded. "Take it," she said. "I don't want it anymore." She looked at me, and her face did something like breaking. I thought I was keeping an eye on the building. I thought maybe if there was a fire or a leak, I'd know first. I told myself I was being useful. You can make anything a kindness if you need it long enough. "Why the blue light?" I asked, because I needed the geometry of our days explained. Hannah's drawing on the fridge flashed in the theater of my brain. Why did she draw a window? Joe swallowed. "When it's dark, the tiniest light looks like a window if it's far enough away," she said, and there was the answer that contained both physics and sorrow. They took the monitor and the receiver and the spool. They bagged the camera. They printed a receipt on thin paper that curled at the edges. The younger detective told me, with careful precision, that it would be up to the county attorney to determine charges. The landlord apologized in a way that felt less like protection and more like a calculation. The boy next door came back for his mother's laundry and said nothing he did not have to say. For a week, the house felt like a stranger we had been intimate with by mistake. I slept with the sound machine on, then turned it off because the white noise felt like deception. Hannah asked if the hum was gone, and I said, "Yes, but hums come back in other shapes." The cat stopped flattening himself and returned to his nest behind the washing machine, dignity intact. If this were a story that wanted to be neat, this would be the part where I forgive Joe and we learn something about boundaries. But there are days I have wanted to skin the word boundary and leave it in the air to dry. Joe brought me a letter handwritten in hard, tidy script. She wrote that she was sorry and that she had thought grief had made her useful, and that she saw now that grief had just made her afraid. "The accident," she wrote, and I realized I had never asked. Her husband, 3 winters ago on black ice, wrapped around a light pole half a block from Fleet Street. After the siren stopped, she wrote, "I sat in the stairwell and listened, and you would be amazed at how loud a house can get when it is trying to be enough." I did not answer her letter right away. I let it live under a magnet on the fridge, next to Hannah's drawing, next to Nebraska. I did not know which hurt to address first. I taped a square of primed plaster over the hole and painted it the wall color, and the patch refused to disappear. The county attorney filed a misdemeanor charge for unlawful surveillance in a shared space. "It won't stick hard," the younger detective said, "because the law likes a camera to see a body before it's mad." She said this with the tired humor of somebody who has lost arguments to statutes. Joe pled no contest. The fine was less than a new water heater. The judge said words like probation and refrain. He did not say the things I needed said, aloud about harm without images. The landlord offered me half off a month's rent. I accepted because you should take money from people who expect you to refuse it as proof of your virtue. I bought Hannah a thick new comforter and a set of glow-in-the-dark stars, and let her decide their pattern on the ceiling. She made the Big Dipper inaccurate so it could hold more. We stayed. That is the part people don't always understand. We stayed because moving is another trauma, and because the school was kind, and because no house is promised. We stayed because Hannah, 1 week after the detectives took the camera, drew our house again with 4 windows, no extras. She drew the long wall as a long wall. She colored the roof green. She gave the cat a smile he does not make in life. Spring came the way it always does, like a letter you forgot you sent to yourself. The bakery started putting pans on the sidewalk to cool. The violin next door became a song we could hum. The landlords on Fleet Street stained their stoops. Jill planted zinnias in the small dirt square by her steps. We waved sometimes, and sometimes did not. She keeps her hearing precious. I keep my windows honest. In the way of neighbors, we have built a new grammar out of fewer words. Do not misunderstand me. The world did not become benign. 2 months later, I found a note under our doormat that said, in a round, childish hand, "The house breathes." It was written in green crayon. I held it up to the light as if it might reveal a watermark of intent. Hannah does not own green crayons. I went upstairs and stood in the stairwell and listened. The house made the sounds it always had, nothing less and nothing more. I taped the note to the inside of the hall closet door, where we keep coats for different weather, where reminders persist without declaring themselves. Once, after Hannah fell asleep with her hair spread like a map of old rivers, I went to the basement and stood by the bins and looked at the lint tracks in the cement dust where the spooled wire had once rested. I pressed my palms to the coolness of the wall and thought of all the places we open and seal without understanding the difference. In the summer, Hannah insisted our cat had learned a new place. She led me to the linen closet. The cat was in the dark with his eyes half-lidded, in the shelf where extra blankets lived. He had dug himself between layers, a creature insisting on softness. Hannah said, like someone who has learned new math, "Sometimes houses hum when they are full." I kissed the top of her head, where the skull still had that slight child bump that felt like the end of the world and the beginning. This would be a good place to end, the clean arc. The mother learns, the child draws, the house returns to itself. But houses in cities have backs as well as fronts, and the best stories I know refuse to be obedient. One August night, after Hannah had fallen asleep beneath her fake constellations, and the violin had run out of songs, and the bakery's sugar settled, I woke to a light. Not a hum, not the old blue. A light bright enough to come through the blinds and lay a knife of white on the floor. It came from the alley behind the houses. I went to the back window and pulled the curtain without making sound, and saw a pickup parked where pickups shouldn't park, its bed full of real estate signs. A man stood in the alley with a headlamp, a bright, perfect circle on his forehead. He was taping a notice on the telephone pole behind our house. The notice was a hearing announcement. Municipal Variance Board. Proposal. Subdivide parcel behind Fleet Street for new construction. The line that mattered, work to include demolition of obsolete service structures and shafts as needed. The next day, the town clerk confirmed what the flyer promised. There would be men in the alley with trucks and the word necessary in their mouths. I stood with my coffee and the blueprint from winter and felt something like grief for a shaft that had held so much. It had been an artery of the house and a throat for harm. You can mourn a thing and still agree that it should be changed. The demo crew arrived with competence and respectful profanity. They cut access on the outside, peeled back a bit of our house like a Band-Aid pulled quick. They filled the shaft with insulation like cotton. They sealed. They patched. They made a box inside a box that would be harder to use for watching. When they were done, the foreman, a woman with a tattoo of the word "stay" on her wrist that I tried not to read as a sign, said, "Want to see the weirdest thing we found?" She handed me a metal rectangle she'd pulled from the base of the shaft, a little plate the size of a playing card. On the back, etched into the steel with something sharp, a date from 15 years ago, and the words, "That was never a window." A different hand had etched below it, "It is now." I put the plate in our junk drawer where things that hold too much gravity go to hide. For a week, the cat scratched at the baseboard where the hole had been, as if memory were a smell, which maybe it is. At the end of August, the board voted, the signs came down, the alley remained largely the same. I pressed my ear to the stair wall once more, out of habit or love. No hum. Houses learn too. Hannah drew our house a third time for back to school, this time with a gigantic garden and a cat so large it looked like a myth. She hung it on the fridge herself with 2 magnets shaped like pears. And on a night when the moon was not out and the heat finally slipped, I went out to the alley and looked back at our row. You learn a house by its back. The windows all looked like equal eyes. The darkness between them looked like a pause. There was no extra window. I stood there until I knew I was not waiting for a light, but listening for a sentence I could live with. The first snow came when it always does. Not a surprise, just a sentence ending in a soft period. The violin played carols it didn't know and made them new. Joe's zinnias died and she cut them clean and left the stems to dream. The bakery switched to morning buns. My daughter sleeps with one hand open, palm up, as if catching anything that falls in the night. Stars, answers, the occasional crumb of ceiling. If she asks me now whether the moon will still be there in the morning, I say what I always say, yes. And if she asks me whether the house breathes, I tell her the truth that is also a spell. It breathes because we do. Sometimes, on dark afternoons when the light thins early, I catch the memory of a blue pulse at the corner of my eye. I look, and there is only the wall, dumb and faithful. I ask it to keep its secrets where we cannot hear them. I ask it to tell me if the world shifts again. On the fridge, the old drawing with the extra window has curled at the edges. I have not thrown it away. It is useful to remember the shapes that fear makes when it wants to be seen. It is useful to remember that sometimes the thing in the wall is not a monster, but a machine. It's useful to remember that machines are only as cruel as their operators, and that most of the time the people who place them have convinced themselves they are good. A week ago, Joe left a paper bag on our stoop with a jar of jam and a note. The note said, "I am trying to listen less with my fear." I wrote back, "Me too." I gave her a drawing Hannah had made of our alley with no cars in it. She taped it on her fridge, and I saw it when she left the door open to carry in groceries. We do not talk about the shaft. We nod at the honesty of summer squash. I lend her a book about old houses that comforts me when I cannot sleep. She returns it with a single line underlined in pencil. It said, "Walls are ears when we are lonely." I am learning, or maybe remembering, that most windows are made with the weight of seeing in mind, but some are invented by longing and fear, and by the need to understand where the tilting comes from. I do not know if we have reached an end. I know that when Hannah brings me her newest drawing and puts her pencil-smudged hand on my knee, I feel the house shift into a shape that holds. On Fleet Street in winter, the air turns a blue you have to teach your eyes to trust. If you stand at the top of the stairs and let the quiet find its level, you will hear what the house is practicing. It's not a hum. It's not an apology. It's something like breath. It is enough.